Hi, my name is Eskil Steenberg, and I'm going to give a talk about game design. And specifically, I'm going to talk about story in game design and how to solve that problem. It feels like a problem that people have been talking about within game design circles forever. And I've been thinking about it for a very long time. And the last couple of years, I've sort of done a lot of research and thought of some interesting theories about game design. So this is kind of the culmination of all that work. So before I begin, I want to start with a disclaimer. This is kind of a semi-academic talk, so I'm going to do things like talk about what is a game and what's not a game and things like that. And the reason I do that is purely because I want to understand games. So if you're making a game or if you like a game or something that I say is not a game, it's not because my reason for saying that is not because I think things that aren't games aren't good or that these are the pure people and these are not. It's simply a way of classifying in order to understand. It's not a value statement that means that something is inherently better than something else. So let's start talking about story. Everybody wants to create an interactive story, and it's been something we've tried to do for a long time, and we've had various different approaches. So before I talk about my approach, I want to go through some of the main approaches that other people have had and what I think is sort of the reason why I don't think they are the right way to go forward. So how do you create an interactive story? Well, the first obvious approach is make a sandbox. Basically, the idea goes something like this. If you could just simulate the whole world with everything in it, then amazing things will happen and you'll have this huge diversity and it'll be amazing. So this sounds reasonable to begin with, but then you start thinking about some reasons why it might not be okay. So let's think about this fact. Think of an action movie, right? So in an action movie, you might have, a fight, you have a car chase, you have jumping out of an airplane, you might have the character finding the love of your life, has a shootout, a couple of things like that, stretched within about 2 hours. So a normal person in a normal life might experience any one of these things, and some people might experience more than one. But no one in the history of the world has ever experienced all of those within 2 hours. Because even though we have a really complex and interesting world, not many interesting things happen. The world as it is kind of boring. And that is the problem, right? The real world is the perfect sandbox, and it's not fun enough. In fact, we're making games to escape reality, so reality can't be what we're aiming for. We need something better than reality. And since reality has the ultimate amount of complexity, we can clearly say that, well, if we just add enough complexity, it'll work out. Well, that clearly can't be the solution. Okay, so let's not do that. Let's do something else. Well, the other obvious one is branching stories, right? You go this way or go that way. It's the idea of choose your own adventure book, basically. So these have some fairly obvious problems. The first one could be content creation, right? So content creation means basically that every time you make a decision, you have to account for that decision in all the content after, and that means exponentially more content. So this is a technical problem, not a fundamental problem. So if we imagine a future where we have enough really good procedural generation, for instance, we could solve this, but it's still a really, really big hurdle. But what I find is that this hurdle is kind of covering for another problem with this approach, and that is the two doors problem. So this is sort of a thought experiment. Imagine if you're playing a pen and paper role-playing game, and the dungeon master tells you there's two doors in front of you, and one says, infinite treasure, and the other one says, horrible monsters. Now, how do you take a decision in this instance? Well, it might seem obvious that infinite treasure is better than monsters, but the problem is that the whole environment and this whole problem was created by someone who's out to create story, which means that whatever you choose, the dungeon master can decide whatever they want to be on the other side of the door. In fact, your decision might not even matter, right? The door could lead to the same thing. Maybe the dungeon master's already decided what you're going to find behind the door, and whatever door you choose doesn't really matter. So what do you do as a player? You're actually trying to deconstruct not the problem in front of you, but you're deconstructing the game designer. You're trying to think of what is the game designer trying to do here, right? And the same thing happens when you watch a movie, right? If you watch, The Terminator, you don't actually think, when you try to figure out what's going to happen next, you think about it in terms of what would the people who made this want to happen. What would be interesting in a movie? If the most plausible, thing would be either that Sarah Connor gets killed or Sarah Connor just gets on a train and is never heard from again. Those are two completely plausible outcomes of the Terminator, but as an audience, we wouldn't think that because it's too boring. So we wouldn't imagine those things happen. We have to think of something more interesting, right? So therefore, we're not thinking in terms of reality. We're thinking in terms of what the designer thought, right? And that means that it's fundamentally different being in a world that is constructed in order to create story than being in a real world. If you see a house and it says 7-Eleven on it, you're not going to assume that that's just there to create an amazingly weird incident when I walk into this building and it's not a 7-Eleven. You're going to assume that it is a 7-Eleven. And that means that if the world is created just for the sake of creating an interesting story, the world becomes very untrustworthy. And that's the basic problem with this. The designers are untrustworthy. The designers are not thinking in terms of what would be possible, they're thinking in terms of what would be interesting. And what's interesting depends on the designer, not the world. So, this is a fundamental problem. But this isn't just a problem with the designer, it's also a problem with the player. And that gets us to the next problem. So here is the Hitler problem. Let's imagine you bought a game that is a World War II sort of shooter, adventure, action game. And at the back of the box you find images of you storming the beaches of Normandy, fighting Rommel in the desert, Battle of Britain, and the Pacific Theater, and all these great things, right? And you're really excited about playing this game. So when you actually start the game, the first thing you see is this guy. It's 1901, and it's Adolf Hitler, and he's playing in his backyard, and he's 10 years old. And you stand there, and you have a gun, right? So now you can kill Hitler. And maybe the designer thought, oh, this is like a really interesting problem, They went to the IGF and got, inspired to do something new and interesting. But what happens is that the player isn't thinking about the moral dilemma of killing Hitler. The player is thinking about, well, if I kill Hitler, do I not get to storm the beaches of Normandy? Because that's what I really bought the game for. The player's not really interested in stopping Hitler at the easiest, most convenient way. In fact, the player wants Hitler to take power. He wants Hitler to start invading countries, because if Hitler doesn't do that, you don't get to play all those bits you wanted to play. And that means that, in fact, both the designer and the player is corrupted. Neither of them are taking realistic decisions that aren't trying to game a system. They're sort of breaking the whole idea of the decisions that you should be taking. So when you start thinking about it, this whole thing about interactive storytelling isn't really working out. In fact, I'm claiming that it's an oxymoron. Now I'm giving a talk right now. This is a video, which means you're listening to it. I'm a storyteller, if you will, and that means that you should shut up. If you interrupt, if you butt in some ways, you make my talk worse. Because that's the fundamental thing about telling. It's called storytelling, not story dialogue. A storytelling incident is a, per definition, not interactive thing. So what we need is a new approach. And the new approach needs to encompass what is special about gaming and interactive, rather than trying to emulate storytelling in other mediums. And I want to make a small observation. Have you ever had a friend who went to the cinema and they come back and you ask them, what was it like? And the first thing they said, there was a fucker in front of me who took 3 calls in the middle of the show, talking out loud. Now this is a very curious thing to say. Because if you imagine the movie makers, they spend millions of dollars on this thing. They have recruited the most compelling and attractive people in the world to be in this movie. They probably put some explosions in there, there's action, there's all these amazing things that happened on the screen. Yet the number one thing that this person who came out of the theater took with them was the fact that somebody took a call. Does that mean that the phone call taking in a cinema is the ultimate story? It's the story that we should make all movies about, because it's obviously more powerful than any movie, because it's the thing people talk about when they leave the theater. No, that's of course not true. But there's something really interesting here that we need to examine. Why is this more important? Well, it's more important because it happens to you. You are a part of a dramatic event where you're a participant and you're experiencing something. And then after that, you want to tell that story. And the fact that you're telling it makes you the storyteller coming out of the theater rather than the storyteller of the director and the people who make the movie. And that is a fundamental idea that story, in fact, is drama retold. Story, as we've bound it up in word, basically is something you're telling. Story and storytelling are linked together. But experiencing something is not a story. It becomes a story when you retell what happened. And therefore, as gamers, game designers, we really want drama. We don't want story. Our goal is not to create a story, but to have our players tell a story once they're, have experienced our piece of medium. So here we can see the power of video games. Games are incredibly powerful. And what you see here is something you will never, ever see in a movie theater. Or have you ever been to a library when someone starts screaming, tearing up the book just because, a character died? Never, because a book and a movie can never be as powerful as a video, as a video game, because a video game, whatever happens there happens to you, and it's sort of more interactive. I'm going to turn this off. It's really annoying. And that leads us to this curve that I like. I call it the Cryo curve. So it incidentally happens to be the opposite of the Laffer curve. So here we can say that if we have interactivity on one axis and we have the emotional impact of that, if we remove a lot of interactivity, like in a movie, we get a lot of control. We can really craft an amazing experience for our viewer. So for instance, E.T. is a movie that makes almost everybody cry. And it's a meticulously made experience designed precisely to evoke a certain emotion. And the lighting and the camera work and the characters and everything is all working together for that purpose. Now, if we start taking away some of the director's power and say, well, you can't place the camera, let's have the audience place the camera, you can't really make something as good as E.T. because you need that control. And if you ask any director, they're going to say, I want more control. I want to be able to do everything. I want to be able to paint every pixel of this movie because I want total control over everything so that everything here leads up to the point that I'm making. So we have games like Uncharted that are very, very controlled and actually are very good. And the more these game designers learn to control the audience, the player, the better they can tell the story. But as soon as you've given a piece of power to the player, they have the ability to ruin your story. For instance, you could just stand still and do nothing, totally ruining the pacing of the story you're telling. So that means that a lot of game designers are trying to control the player. And they find that the more they control the player and the more control they retain, the better the story gets. However, you can also see that as the curve goes towards more interactivity, it goes down, but after a while it goes up. And the reason for that is because now it's no longer the designer's story. Now it's the story that unfolds dynamically. It's something that the player is involved in. And then it gets more and more powerful. And sports is a great example of that. So you get really engaged in a game of football because it's something that live is happening and is dynamic. And especially if you're part of playing that game and you have an influence, then it becomes incredibly emotional. Even though it's not lit correctly, and even though the camera isn't perfect, the fact that you're in it is so powerful that it sort of overrides all of that. And that's why you see, people are going to be crying at E.T., but it's going to be a fairly rare thing compared to, say, the exuberation you will find, at a soccer game, because people will go nuts there in a way that, a lot of books and, non-interactive things could ever elicit. So this brings me to an interesting point about designers. And I think that designers are very much like fashion designers. So if you look at this woman, she has a beautiful dress with lots and lots of colors. Now this happens to be an Alexander McQueen creation, and if you see that on a catwalk, you might say, oh my God, he's an amazing designer, and he's so great. The problem is, if you see a woman walking down the street like this, you're probably going to think she's crazy. She's probably very egocentric. She is not a person that you want to be with, because you're no longer looking at the clothes, as themselves. You're looking at a person, and the clothes just reflects on the person. What you really see is somebody who chose to look like this. And what you're questioning is not the beauty of the clothes, you're questioning the wisdom of wearing this to an office. That's what you're thinking, right? And that means that a really good fashion designer doesn't make beautiful clothes. A really good fashion designer makes interesting people. Like, when I buy this shirt, what I want is not for people to say, oh, that's a nice shirt. I want people to come up to me and think I'm interesting. And they shouldn't talk about the shirt. They just think they should just like me. I want to be liked. And if this shirt helped me, that's great. I'm not here to, make a designer happy about his shirt. I don't want to, sit here and tell everybody whose shirt I'm wearing. I want people to talk about me. And therefore, I think the best dress ever made is the Breakfast with Tiffany dress. It's the little black thing. It made her career, right? It's a defining piece of clothing, but no one knows who designed it. It's not about the clothing, it's about the woman, right? It's about the character. And we fall in love with the character, not the outfit. We look up to her because she has sense of style, not because, there was a designer somewhere out there that was good. It's her that we're looking at. And games should be really the same thing. You should never experience a game and say, oh my God, this game was amazing. You should say, oh my God, I did this amazing thing in this game, right? I am the key character. I am the interesting bit in this. And that's really difficult for a lot of game designers, because game designers, they want to put themselves out there. They like all people, they want to express themselves. And I think the game development is a fairly poor way of expressing yourself, because it's not about expressing yourself, it's about someone else expressing themselves in your game. So if games are so different, we can assume that story rules for telling stories don't apply to games. So I want to give just a very simple proof of this. And the first one is that characters are not non-essential. Now, if you learn anything about story, like if you read about storytelling, they'll tell you it's all about story. And the reason for that is because in a movie or a book or something, you have to care about what happens. You have to have empathy for the characters that are in there. And there's a rule in storytelling called "don't kick the dog." What that means that if your character kicks a dog, it's going to be so off-putting to the audience that the audience are going to say, I no longer care what happens to this character. He's just a mean, evil person, and I don't want to know the ending. I'm not invested in this, person's success anymore. I don't care. Now, in a video game, you can kick as many dogs as you want. It doesn't matter, because you will always be interested in your own success. Go find the worst serial killer in the world, and they'll still care about their own happy outcome. You don't get to the point, usually, unless you have serious problems, where you say, I've been so bad that I no longer care what happens to me, right? So that's a fundamental difference. That's why you don't need a character in Tetris to agree with and say, yeah, we gotta, build these blocks. It's just, here's a problem. Can you solve it? And it's like, yeah, I can solve it. So you want to be that person. So before I move on, you might ask, is there no point in having any storytelling whatsoever in games? Well, I do believe that, I used to believe no, there isn't. But I've kind of changed my mind. And here's the reason. This is Star Wars, how Star Wars begins. Now you might say, hey, wait a minute, Star Wars is a movie. And this isn't a movie. This is, in fact, a piece of text. It's a piece of, you could say it's a book, or, it's a written medium. But Star Wars still begins with this bit. And the reason is because in order to experience the real thing, which is the movie, you kind of need a bit of introduction to this world. And this scroll sort of says, okay, so there's a bunch of stuff going on. We don't have time to show it to you, but here it is, and here comes movie. If you just stick with us for 10 seconds, there's going to be a massive spaceship on screen, and there are going to be lasers. So just read this, and then we're going to get into the movie. And in story terms, this is called exposition. So exposition, if you don't know, is the bit of a story that you need the audience to know. Like, maybe you need the audience to know that this character is unhappy. But it's not really about that bit in the story. Like, that's not the story how you get unhappy. It just needs to know it. So then you need to find a really clever way of sort of weaving into the story, ooh, he's unhappy. And everyone who works in writing, either for film or books or something like, hate exposition and want to find ways of not having page after page of exposition, because that's the boring stuff. It's just sort of the background stuff you need. But sometimes it's really useful. If we have storytelling in games as exposition, it's basically we're jumping to another medium in order to set up the thing we're really doing. Exposition can be very, very simple, like this one, right? So in chess, you could say the exposition is the shape of the pieces. A horse does very vaguely what a real horse does, but really it's not that important. It just gives you sort of some kind of handle to get into the world. Now, if you're an experienced chess player, none of this matters. It's sort of a thing you think about when you start, that this is a king and queen, and once you've done that, you could rename them whatever, it doesn't matter, the shape doesn't matter, it's just a brilliant game for the game rules and the actual drama that is created through the game, but as a starting point, it can be really nice. However, it can be really bad too. So here's one of my favorite first-person shooters ever. It's the original Doom. Now, Doom is, really crappy looking graphically today, but that had some really good things with it. So for instance, the fireball you see here travels incredibly slow and isn't at all, affected by gravity. It doesn't look ridiculous because the whole game looks ridiculous, so it kind of works. But in a modern game, you would say, hey, that looks ridiculous. Reality doesn't work like that. So you would actually try to make the fireball work in a more realistic way. Well, one of the nice things about Doom is that you can actually dodge fireballs. If they were thrown at a real speed, it would be way harder. So this is a case where the sort of veneer of the game, which would be the visual design, the settings, have encroached on the actual game design. And that, I think, is really bad. So that's why I think you should actually do this. You should create your games in a sort of abstract world and just say, this is the rules that I want, and this is how it's going to work. Once you've done that, you can say, oh, we're in space, or oh, this is Second World War, whatever you need to do to sort of dress it up. But you should make sure not to sort of start with a dress up and go from there. And that's a really difficult thing to do. And especially, I think, a lot of games sell because of sort of the premise of them rather than the actual content. It's like, oh, I want to go in space. Well, how it actually mechanically works is what's going to make the game good or bad. But, ooh, cool spaceships on the back of the box. That's what's going to sell the game. So now we've talked a little bit about story and sort of giving you some structure to this discussion, and now I want to get into the real meat. Now I want to talk about the pivot model. So the pivot model is my way of breaking down a game and defining what a game is and what you need, all the elements, and how they work together. So the first element you're going to need is mechanics. So game mechanics are something that every game needs, which basically creates a cause and effect system in your world. So here are some of the things you need. A mechanic is predictable. And this is really important because a mechanic, by being predictable, it means that you can take proper decision. Since you create cause and effect that are predictable, you can say, I'm going to do this so that this happens. And that's different from having a real game designer who's live narrating or something like that, that is totally unpredictable, right? You need to understand the world before you can take any decisions. That's the primary thing that mechanics do. It also describes the possibility space. What is possible in this world? What is not possible? What are my limitations and what are my opportunities? And it describes the player interaction. This is what the players do in the game. So if you build something that only has mechanics, you get this. You get what I call a toy. So Lego is a great example. You can put them together. There's rules for how you can put them together, and you can make whatever you want, and you can predict how things are going to work, and you can actually make a drawing and say, oh, I'm going to build this, and then you can build it because it's predictable, and you can have a goal and all that stuff, and it's very clear. Now, a toy is limited, so we're going to add our second element, which is a goal. Now it's getting interesting. So a goal means you're actually trying to achieve something. And what that entails is it provides meaning and direction. So you know what you're doing, basically. It defines success and failure. Whereas, Lego, you can't fail at Lego. You can just build different things. There's no wrong way and right way. It's just you build whatever you want. If you have a goal, then there's a right way and wrong way. And it can be hierarchical. So for instance, you might have a goal to, level up this much by killing these things, and then when you level up, you can do this, and when you can do this, you can do that. So you have this sort of stack of goals that you can build. For instance, there's many, many ways of structuring goals, and I'm not going to get into it. There's lots of people thinking about that problem and whatever, so I'm not going to move on. So what happens when we put together goals and mechanics? We get a puzzle, right? So a puzzle is something you can solve using your mechanics in order to achieve the goal, basically. So a crossword puzzle would be the obvious one. You type in letters and you put it together. That's a puzzle. It's a very basic thing. However, something is missing from a puzzle. And to explain this, I'm going to take an example of a puzzle. So an example of a puzzle would be driving to work, right? So there you have a goal, which is work or home, depending which direction you're going. And you have mechanics, which is you can turn left, you can turn right, you can go forward. You can choose which way you navigate a city street. However, this is a really boring game because it's not a real game. You do it once, you solve the problem, and then you're done. So when you go to work the 378th day, you're still driving the same way. It's totally not interesting. And that's why no one wants to solve the same crossword puzzle over and over again. Because once you've solved it, that's it. It's done. Right? It doesn't have any reaction. So in order to illustrate what you need, I have an invention I call the Get Lost-a-thon 3000. 2000. Oh, I downgraded it. So this is a device you put on your dashboard in your car. And whenever you get to an intersection, it will either light up an LED that says go wherever you want, or it will randomly select go left, go right, or go straight forward. Now this means if you're following this thing, you have some control over where you're going, but you also are at the mercy of this random generation thing. There's certain decisions you can take, but there's certain decisions you don't have the ability to take. Now what does this mean? Well, it means a lot of things, because you can no longer expect to drive the same way to work every day. And in fact, you can't solve it in your house. Whereas driving to work in a normal you could pull up a map and just draw a line and then go that way. Just like you can actually solve a crossword puzzle without actually filling in all the characters. You could solve it first and then fill in the characters. Because nothing's going to happen between your decision and the final outcome. Whereas if you have this Get Lost-a-thon, you're going to have to change all the time depending on circumstantial thing. So that is the third thing, which I call acceptable failure. You need to have a way to fail, and it needs to be acceptable. I call it acceptable failure because the acceptable bit is the really hard design problem, because it's really easy to make something just fail, but to make it in a way so that the player accepts it and think it's fair, that's way harder. So let's look at what we want acceptable failure to do. So it provides uncertainty. That's the first and obvious thing. It interacts with the mechanics, so that the mechanics and the random bits are sort of controlling each other a little bit. It makes it impossible to plan, as I said. The scope of acceptable failure needs to be known. The Get Lost-a-thon tells you can throw left, right, or forward. It can never say go to Reno. And therefore, you can plan for the unpredictability. So for instance, if you drive a certain way to work, you might say, I want to take left here, even though going straight would be more likely to get me to home. But if I go straight, I might get Lost-a-thon to tell me to go right, and then I'll actually end up on the freeway, and I'll never be able to get back home. So I'm actually going to plan for the eventuality that this random number generation is going to do something I don't want, and I'm going to try to avoid that area so that I don't accidentally happen to find myself on the freeway. And that is a really interesting thing for game designers, because as a game designer, that gives complexity without actually adding very much complexity. Because the player's thinking many steps ahead and not just a single step ahead, because it has to think about the probabilities of different things happening in the future and what the ramifications will mean. So actually, when you're taking decisions with an acceptable failure, you're actually trying to optimize your statistics, if you will. You're trying to say, well, this might be bad now, but it's going to give me an advantage in the future because I'm going to avoid the potential of that pitfall later on, or something like that. So how do you create acceptable failure? Well, random number generation, die roll, is probably the oldest way of doing this. Another way of doing it is to simply have a human opponent. A human opponent is also something that you can't predict and you don't know what they will do and blah, blah, blah. Or you can have artificial intelligence that sort of creates the illusion of a random, non-understandable opponent. Again, the AI cannot cheat. It needs to be acceptable. And actually, it's harder to make an AI feel acceptable than a player. Like if you snipe someone across a very large map in a multiplayer game, if you get sniped, it's okay because you can snipe them back. It feels fair. If an AI does that, it's totally unfair because you didn't see them. The AI had to give you notice, right? So when designing an AI, you have to make the AI way nicer than you can allow players to be. Because players feel that, oh, we're both humans, so you did something unfair to me, I can probably do something unfair to me, so it sort of balances out and it's not as unfair as if, oh, well, you're a computer, you can solve anything, it's not fair. Okay, so let's put all these things together, and what do we get? We get a game. That's awesome. This is what I call a game. It needs to have all these three things. And what do you get in a game? You get this. Let's see if this plays. So basically, you get these amazing experiences that we all crave for in games, right? It's basically when you do that backflip and you do this amazing move, or you crash something, or these amazing little sort of pieces of a story. Like that's really what you make YouTube videos out of. It's like, oh, you got to see this headshot I did, or this no scope thing, or whatever. Like these amazing things. And if you're a gamer, you intuitively just love these moments. You can play a game for an hour maybe and have one or two of those like incredible, amazing experiences and be like, oh my God, did you see that thing? That was so cool. That's kind of what you're craving when you're a gamer. Here is sort of a structured way of looking at this. You can have mechanics at the top, you have acceptable failure and a goal, and if you have only mechanics and a goal, you get a puzzle, and if you have acceptable failure and mechanics, I kind of call that a sandbox. So a sandbox is basically a game where there's no direction. You can play around with it and random things happen. You don't have control of certain things, you have control of other things, but there's no goal. But if you put them all together, you get a game. So at this point, you might feel a little disappointed. Maybe you, like me, wanted to make epic stories. You wanted to make like amazing, earth-shattering, really awesome stories that would rival the best books and films and things like that. I mean, we wanted this. This is the reason like we get into making popular media, right? We want the I am your father moment, and it's awesome. And what we get from games is kind of like that, ooh, I tripped and fell moment. And oops, I shot a guy and it was kind of cool, but we get gifts. We don't get epic stories. We get what I call an intermezzo. It's this little thing. Now, they are fun and they're cool and they're pretty much like missing the bus or something like that we would tell each other. But they're not epic. They're not what we want. So something here is missing. We need another element. We already have a game, but we want something more. So the next one is situational pivots. It should say 4 there, not 3. So a situational pivot is the but-then element of a story. Imagine you're making a real story. You go in one direction and the characters are doing something, but then something happens that flips everything upside down. So let's take a look at a real story, right? Here is Star Wars, right? Oh, we're going to go to Alderaan. It's just, a ride on the spaceship. And oh my God, there's TIE fighters now. We're in fighting. Oh, we survived that. That's so. Oh no, there's a tractor beam. Now, we have to dress up like stormtroopers to hide ourselves from, the evil empire. Oh, there's a princess here. We have to go find the princess. Let's save her. Oh no, there's stormtroopers coming. We got to get away from them. Oh, let's go into this trash compactor. Oh no, the trash compactor is compacting us into little pieces. We need to stop it, right? So we have these switches of where the characters in a story are sort of, the story is shifting, right? And if you look at something like a football game, you would have the same thing, right? So here is the story of a football game. Starts 0-0, and then someone scores, and then the other people, scores, and, it goes back and forth. And when you retell the story that came out of the drama from this football game, these are the key points you're going to talk about. Like these are the turning points when something changed, something happened that made the story interesting. So we need to do this in games in order to tie together these little sort of random cool events that we have into one coherent story. And that's what I call situational pivots. So let's have a look at what a situational pivot can be. It's a state that changes the situation of a game. It forces you to reevaluate the strategy you're playing with. And it should be possible to change with a combination of mechanics and acceptable failures. Like this state should not be changeable by the players themselves, just willy-nilly whenever they want to. It should be something that impacts them, that they have some control over, but not full control over. It should preferably be neutral. And this is really actually hard to design. But what you really want is two states of a world where one state isn't inherently bad, whereas another state is inherently good. And you want very few of these, because if you have too many, each state becomes less important. So you want few states that mean a lot of things. So this might sound really hard. So let's actually take an example and explain this with a real game that anybody can play. So let's pick Monopoly. It's a pretty bad game, but pretty much everybody understands it. So let's analyze Monopoly, right? So Monopoly has mechanics, right? You can buy, you have money, you have selling, you have cards, these are all mechanics, right? You have a goal, create a Monopoly, this is in the title. You have acceptable failure, which is the die roll, and the cards. Which card you get might be an acceptable failure. So the dice here are completely fair because we accept that we'll end up on someone's street because the die rolls told us to. No one ever has to make a decision I'm going to go on someone's hotel and pay them a lot of money. That's something that happens to you through the die roll. And it doesn't have a situational pivot. So let's talk about how a game of Monopoly usually plays out. It plays out something like this. Someone gets some good streets, other people end up on those streets, that person gets more streets, people end up on those streets, that person wins. And that's a pretty boring story, and it's the reason that Monopoly is a pretty boring game that doesn't create very many interesting stories. So let's create a situational pivot for Monopoly, right? So let's have a switch in the game that says that the game can be played in two modes, either in bull market or in bear market. Either market is going up or it's going down, right? If we're playing in bull market, normal rules apply, right? So we just play normal Monopoly. But in bear market mode, if you end up on someone's street, they have to pay you instead, right? So it's completely the opposite. Now, we get the rule that if two players on the board put in some money and agree, they get a die roll with a fairly high chance to flip the market. So if you and I decide, oh, we don't like the state of the market, we can put in some money and probably, but not 100% completely, flip the market to the other state. If you pass go, you can roll a die, and there's a very, very small chance that the mode may switch even though nobody has asked for it to switch. Okay, so now let's imagine a game being played with this, right? So the game begins, Alice gets all the good streets, right? But Bob and Carl flips the market, oh my God, right? Now Alice is desperate, but Bob gets rich, right? And he aligns with Alice because now he's rich too, right? So now he wants to flip the market to positive, right? And everything's really bad and blah, 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 right? And he's, Carl is on the edge of ruin, but then he trades away his last street and the market crashes and he picks up some really good pay wins and it goes back and forth, right? So now you get a really interesting story that goes back and forth and you have these sort of turning points that create a real story. So this was a fairly simple example. There are some issues with this game design. Probably, for instance, you want to make it so that it's actually slightly better to be in bull market than bear market. Otherwise, no one will ever buy any houses and things like that. But it gives you an idea of the kind of rules that you should add to a game to create a situational pivot. So let's talk about some examples of situational pivots in games. And this can actually help us explain why some games work really well, right? So the first thing is the Counter-Strike bomb plant, right? It changes the objective of the game. Now it's about defending or disarming the bomb. It creates an alternative win opportunity, right? I might be the only terrorist left, but if I plant the bomb, now I have a chance again. I may not think I can shoot them all, but I can turn the tables, right? There's some cons to this one. For instance, it changes no mechanics, right? It'd be really good if, planting the bomb made some weapons bad or some weapons good. I don't know how magically that would work, but something like that, so that you could, for instance, arm yourself with things that are good in the bomb state or bad in the normal state or something like that. Another con is you can't defuse the bomb, right? You can have one switch in your story, you can't have multiple ones. If you could imagine a game where somebody could plant the bomb, disarm the bomb, kill that guy, take the bomb, plant it again, back and forth, that would create these really, really interesting stories that could go long and be more depth, right? You could do multiple pivots. So that would create better drama out of Counter-Strike. Another example is Formula One. So in Formula One, unless you're not knowledgeable with Formula One, rain is a big deal. So whenever it starts raining, everything changes, right? Some tires are really crap. You have to get rain tires. You have to go switch tires. It's a very different skill driving in the wet. So some cars become really bad. Some cars become really good. Some drivers become really bad. Some drivers become really good. Everything changes when it starts raining, right? And even the anticipation of it might start raining has an impact, right? I might say, oh, I'm not going to switch tires, even though I should, because I want to wait a couple more minutes, see if it starts raining. Because if I go to the switch then I'll switch to rain tires. Whereas if I switch now to dry tires, and it starts raining, then I'm screwed because I have to go back in and get rain tires. If it starts raining and I'm on dry tires, I might say, well, I don't think it's going to rain very long. I think it's just going to be a short shower, 1 minute, and then it's all going to dry up. So if I go and change tires now, it's actually not going to be worth it because I'm just going to have to change back in a minute. So I'm going to drive on these really terrible tires for 1 minute and hope that it turns back. So that's a gamble, right? And that creates these really interesting pivot points, right? The con, of course, is that it's not interactive. The drivers themselves can't influence the weather. It'd be really interesting if the drivers could say, I'm behind, but I'm going to switch to rain because I think I have a better opportunity in rain because the driver who's in front of me isn't a good rain driver, and I am. Or I'm just about to switch tires, and he has already switched tires, so if I start raining now and I switch to my rain tires, I'll be ahead, or something like that. Obviously, that's not how reality works. Again, the con is, it rarely rains at all. It should need to start raining and stop raining a couple of times during each race for this to really be awesome. But, you can't control the weather. So, another one is player needs is an interesting way that a lot of games, like for instance DayZ does, right? So bleeding, hunger, low ammo, where you play one way and then you run out of ammo or you start bleeding, and all of a sudden the game's not about, looking through this area to find, Professor X. It's now about, finding something that can stop the bleeding with, or finding more bullets, or something like that. It creates a really urgency of priority, and that's why I think you get some really nice pivots there. The cons here is that these situations are not seldom wanted situations, right? You're not going to stab yourself in the leg in order to start bleeding so that you can change your play style from, fighting enemies to looking for bandages because you want to play in the looking for bandages mode. That's not a reasonable way of playing. And it's also a very single player thing because it's an experience that each player have for themselves. It's about their personal stats. It's not something that happens in the world. If it happens in the world, you can include multiple players, and it makes it more interesting to have a shared story, if you will. So here's a couple of possible situational pivots that I've been thinking about. So for instance, in a magic game, you could have elemental magic, where you have, ice, fire, earth, whatever, and then have inhibitor fields that says, oh, I can cast a spell or do something so that no more fire spells work for a certain amount of time or something like that. And I can use that to my advantage and try to play a certain way so that I exhaust all my fire spells, and then I kill it so that no one can use fire spells after I've done mine, but I have other ones left, and other people may have all their fire spells left, but they can't use them now, for instance. Power grids is an interesting thing, something I'm using in the game that I'm developing right now. Turn on and off power. If you turn on power, you get lights, you get machines, you get things like that. But if you turn it off, you don't get that, but you get no security systems working, no cameras. You can hide in the dark. You have all these other possibilities of things that you might want to do when there's no power compared to what you want to do when power is available. Faction control is another one. You might have a game where there's two factions. Maybe it's the police and the mob. And sometimes you want the mob to control the city because you want to be able to do illegal things, and sometimes you want the police to control the city because you want to be able to do other things. So that's sort of how factions can create a pivot in the game. And when you do things like that, it's really important to sort of make it really permeate throughout the city so that everything you see really reflects this new reality. Another one that I like is cavitation. So cavitation is basically water boiling when you put pressure on it. So it's not heat, it's just how you pressure it. So if you have a propeller on a submarine, if you drive really slow, it won't cavitate, there'll be no bubbles. It'll be really quiet, but it'll also be really slow. But then you have another situation where you drive the submarine really fast. Now you have more agility, you can do more things, but on the other hand, it's easier to spot it, right? So that's two different situations. And you might want to go from one to the other and whatever. So that's a possible one you could do. You could have level change. Like for instance, let's say you're in a boat that rotates, that is capsized, right? So maybe you have a way to move water from one part of the boat to the other, to capsize it in different ways, to get different advantages and different ways of being able to solve problems and get the environment to your advantage. Opening doors, flooding things. I mean, there's lots of, raising the lava. You can think of things like that that drastically change the environment you're doing. Light and darkness is another one. We talked about a little bit of power. Basically, sometimes, day-night cycle, that kind of thing. Day-night cycle, obviously not as good because you usually can't change the day-night cycle. But if you have a way of maybe sleeping away time or shifting time or something like that so that you can do certain things at night and certain things at day, and you can flip between these two sometimes, but not always. So, of course, the model doesn't solve how you should design your game, but it creates a framework for understanding games. And this is really, really important. When you write a movie, you can, take all these books about, how to write books, but they will tell you things like, you need to have a good antagonist, right? But it won't tell you what that antagonist is. And it turns out that it's really hard to find a good antagonist, to find a reasonable reason why somebody needs to be evil, right? That's really hard to do. But knowing that you need that element in your story is really the first step in order to be able to write something that is really good. And this basically, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find the structure where you can basically solve this. And creativity is actually finding the elegant ways of following the rules. And it turns out that these rules that I've outlined now are fairly easy to understand, but to make a game that actually adheres to them in a smart and fluid way that feels natural is really tricky. So that's my talk, and I want to thank you for listening, and that was it. I hope you contact me and talk to me and what you think about this. If you need more advice or if you want something clarified, just email me. I'm at Eskil@obsession.se. And that's all. Bye-bye.